So welcome to the State of the State Department, Reforming U.S. Diplomacy. It is quite a hot topic. And before I introduce our panelists, I actually want to just read a quick excerpt from the report that Ambassador Ries, one of our panelists, wrote, just so that we all can set the stage for today's conversation. And in this excellent report, A U.S. Diplomatic Service for the 21st Century, she writes, many of the most serious challenges the United States will face in 2021 and beyond will require our diplomats to take the lead. These include the return of great power competition, leading a global response to the pandemic and its consequences, supporting American companies overseas during a devastating recession, mounting a major effort on climate change, negotiating an end to the Afghan and Iraq wars, and helping American citizens in every corner of the world who need the support of their government. Morale in the State Department, however, is at an all-time low, and efforts to promote greater racial and ethnic diversity have failed just when the country needs women and men of all backgrounds as our primary link to nearly every country in the world. There are challenges to be met inside the Foreign Service, including an honest self-assessment of the service's internal culture as well. So that sets the stage for a very hot topic today, and we're very delighted to have three excellent panelists. Before I begin, just a really quick word about Network 2020 for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We are a New York-based nonprofit. We're an inclusive international community that's really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and foreign policy worlds, and also trying to drive and support innovative solutions to key foreign policy challenges. So today we are joined by a top-notch panel. We have Ambassador Marcie Ries. She is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center's Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School. And also a senior advisor in the Department of State's Foreign Service Institute Leadership and Management School. She has nearly a 4-decade career in the Foreign Service, serving in places a lot in Europe, including Kosovo, Bulgaria, Albania, but also in Baghdad, London, and Brussels. She has a lot of experience on issues such as arms control and NATO. She is the recipient of the U.S. Army's Distinguished Civilian Service Medal and a Presidential Meritorious Service Award. There is a lot more to her bio, but in the interest of time, I am condensing all of them. We also have Elizabeth Shackelford. Lizzie is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and an independent consultant. She was actually, I entered the Foreign Service with her, so she and I started together, and I left before she did, and when she left, her resignation letter got a widespread attention across the world, and has been drawing attention to the declining state of diplomacy under Trump. She is the author of The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age. She previously worked with Booz Allen Hamilton and led USAID projects, and has widely appears in the media at this point. And we are also joined by Chris Richardson, who is also a former US diplomat. He is a prominent immigration attorney and co-founder of the world's leading remote video immigration consulting technology company, Argo Visa. He has served in places including Nigeria, Nicaragua, Pakistan, and Spain, and has a lot of work on non-immigrant and immigrant visas, and managed hundreds of officers and local staff in some of the most dangerous postings around the world. He resigned in protest due to President Trump's Muslim ban and derogatory statements about African countries. He is also widely published in the media as well. So we have three top-notch panelists today, and just to kick off, I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Ries, because the Future of Diplomacy project that you run at Harvard, they recently published this report from which I just read an excerpt. And it's one of several initiatives that we're hearing about recently that are examining ways to rethink the mission and mandate of the State Department. And I was wondering, could you put all of this in context for us? Why are all of these initiatives happening now?
Well, as the excerpt that you read shows, the Foreign Service is in a kind of a crisis at the moment. It lacks funding, support, training, and educational opportunities for the members of the Foreign Service, just at the moment when the country is facing all these diplomatic challenges, which you listed. Historically, the change has come to the Foreign Service at times of big historic change. For example, the first Foreign Service Act came in 1924 at the end of World War I, when it became evident that the United States needed more diplomatic heft. Then again, after World War II, same thing, where there was a general feeling that the Foreign Service wasn't adequate, wasn't big enough, didn't have enough heft to meet the challenges that the United States was facing in the world. And then we had another act in 1980 at the end of the Vietnam era. So that's 40 years ago, and the world has changed a lot since then. So that's another reason. We have some very serious fundamental problems in the Foreign Service: the lack of diversity, which you mentioned, politicization. The service is a nonpartisan service, just the way the military is nonpartisan, or the intelligence community. But over time, we've seen, and this is not just a problem of the current administration, but we have seen that successive administrations have appointed people, have put political appointees in key positions deeper and deeper into the Foreign Service. So today, there is not one single career official serving as a confirmed assistant secretary, which is really the sort of the real policy point in the State Department. And finally, there's really inadequate support for professionalization in the Foreign Service, just at the moment when we have all kinds of challenges that require special technical expertise. So, and we have many new challenges in the world which require diplomatic, not military solutions. So for all of those reasons, I think this is a moment when people feel that the State Department, and especially the Foreign Service, needs to be rebuilt and modernized.
And just to follow up on that a little bit, you mentioned the politicization of the service. Is that something that how has something like that been allowed to happen, where it doesn't necessarily happen in other parts of government service like the military? Why is it that it was able to happen within the diplomatic service?
Well, quite honestly, the American Foreign Service has had political appointees serving as ambassadors since the 19th century. But what has happened over time is that the percentage of political appointees, I'm talking about the modern Foreign Service starting in the 20th century, that the career Foreign Service, the percentage of the career Foreign Service, the positions that are held by career people, has diminished over time. This has been a sort of going in this direction. The usual was sort of, for ambassadors, was 25% political appointees and 75% for the Foreign Service. But I do want to pick up one point you made, which is that other foreign services do not do this. We are fairly unique in the world. There are a few other countries that have a handful of political appointees, but none who do it consistently the way we do. And if you think about this, does this make sense? I mean, would we have a diplomat being the captain of an aircraft carrier? No, I don't think so. So why would we appoint people with no diplomatic background to be our ambassadors? So we've proposed actually something that we would phase in over time, 10%, 90% ratio. But then that's just ambassadors. What we've seen is over time, there have been more and more political appointments down into the policy arena in the State Department in Washington, appointments of undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, and so on. The State Department has more political appointees than any other Washington cabinet agency.
And is that something that a revised Foreign Service Act would be able to encode, that to limit the number of political appointees? Is that the mechanism by which that would happen?
Well, we would propose that we phase in a different proportion of ambassadors through, over a period of 5 years, let's say. I think one way to approach it would be a Foreign Service Act, which is another proposal that we've made, is that we need a new Foreign Service Act now. But essentially, particularly with ambassadors, it's the prerogative of the president to nominate ambassadors. And I think we would have to see affirmative commitments from successive presidents in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much. I have more questions for you, Ambassador, but we'll get back to you in a bit. Lizzie, turning to you, your departure from the State Department in 2017 garnered a lot of attention, in part because of your very direct message to then Secretary of State Tillerson, and also in part because you really were a rising star in U.S. diplomacy. And you've since written a book that delves into the devolving state of U.S. foreign policy. How do you think State Department reform can effectively respond to the changing demands on diplomacy?
Thank you very much, Courtney. I'd start out by saying that I agree with a lot of what Ambassador Ries has already raised in terms of, where the starting point is and where some of the challenges have begun. But one issue that I think is, which Ambassador Ries mentioned, that I think is really critical, is that we roll back from the militarization and military being in the lead in our foreign policy. And that requires some kind of fundamental reform, but it also requires a real shift in our thinking about what are national security, priorities, and how do we approach them. One thing that we've seen over the past couple of decades is, a shift towards the military really taking the lead, which 20 years ago might have made sense in a context where we see our greatest threat as being international terrorism and violence. But of course, today we're seeing something very different from that. And we're on the back end, however, of a period of time where we've had this cycle that's been reiterating itself, where the State Department didn't have the resources that it needed to meet the threats at the time a couple of decades ago. And so a lot of the tasks that should have gone to civilian-led foreign policy teams went to the military instead. Then you have the military doing these activities, so they continue to get tasked with them and resourced to do them. We saw a lot of this in terms of kind of nation-building efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what I think a lot of Americans aren't aware of, and others, is that it trickles down through all sorts of other elements of who's taking the lead and how we're being resourced to do so. My last tour was in Somalia. And that was a place where the diplomats were not even sufficiently resourced to go outside of the airport compound. What that meant in practice is that we had U.S. military personnel who could travel around Mogadishu in the country and ended up getting dragged into all sorts of discussions with our counterparts in Somalia, with our civilian counterparts in Somalia. And thereby they take the lead. They take the lead visibly because they're with the ones out in the communities and with the government, and they take the lead in action. And that left us really not prepared and positioned to play a lead role. So in terms of, how do we approach that reform? I think that we need to do it from, we do need more people and more money with the State Department, absolutely, and with our development colleagues as well. But that's not going to be enough without shifting our approach and having the State Department empowered to lead. And that means a lot of kind of technical, resource issues. As Ambassador Ries mentioned, we need the type of training and investment in our personnel in the State Department that you see in the military, which we do not have. But we also need, the executive and legislative branches to really kind of consider the civilian side in the lead of what we're doing. That makes sense. It would have made sense over the past couple of decades, but as you look at what the national security threats are to us now, a global pandemic, climate change, other issues that do not have military solutions, things that need to be negotiated in a globalized world, we need to have civilians in the lead of that, with the military supporting what we need to do. So I would say, kind of wrapping that up into what it really means for how we reform and to face these issues. You're going to need, I do think that we need some legislative changes. A new Foreign Service Act is probably really called for. I think empowering the State Department does require depoliticizing it, which means, as Ambassador Ries mentioned, reducing the number and the dominance of political appointees. This isn't just smart in terms of having people who are qualified to do these jobs, but it's also smart in terms of having a longer term vision. If you're appointed by an administration that may or may not be there in 4 years, you're looking for wins that are going to happen in that time period and enough time to support that administration's reelection. You're not looking at people who understand what's been happening for the prior decade or two in a particular region or country and are looking ahead to how you build to improvements in that bilateral relationship over the next coming decade. So I think that's what you get with the longer term view that professionals have. So I think in addition to limiting the numbers and percentage that we have of appointees, political appointees, I think that we should look at some qualifications. If you have these, for those who don't know, they're Schedule C appointments, or the types of political appointees that go all the way down through the ranks in the State Department. There should be some basic criteria of experience for a lot of these roles, so that you can't simply fill it with a lot of folks who worked hard in a campaign, for example. There's a place for that, but I don't think it's necessarily in a special envoy's office dealing with something that you might not know about. So I would say, we need to look at it holistically. We need to look at it in terms of our attitude over how we treat who's really running the show. And we need to sufficiently resource and train and give the State Department what it needs to succeed, so that what we don't see is a very well-resourced military, Pentagon, leaning in the future to take over if the State Department can't meet these very real global challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I think it's one that's not that's made not just by diplomats, but one of our favorite events as we bring the military fellows from the Council on Foreign Relations to speak with Network 2020, and they would say the same exact thing. They're saying, why are we the ones who are out there doing this diplomatic work? That's not what we're trained to do. But when you're looking at budgets and when you're looking at that constant push and pull within the embassy of keeping their people secure, but also enabling them to do the work, I think it gets quite tricky. But yeah, excellent point. So turning to you, Chris, one area of a reimagined State Department is the urgent need to develop a diplomatic corps that is reflective of the US population. And you have really been a leading voice among those calling for meaningful diversity changes in US diplomacy. But as we've spoken about, these diversity initiatives, that this isn't a new thing. So how come they haven't taken hold yet, and what would really effective change look like?
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Ambassador Ries. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's such an honor to be on this panel. I think to understand why the State Department still struggles with diversity, why it still struggles with this fact that so many, there's so few African Americans in leadership, so few women in leadership at the State Department, you really have to go back to 1924. You have to go back to when the original Foreign Service Act was written. So when that was written to professionalize the Foreign Service, the first African American to take the test and pass the test, Clifton Wharton, after he actually passed the test, the reaction of the State Department wasn't one of joy, it was one of horror. The director of the Foreign Service, Joseph Grew, met with the leadership of the State Department, and they sat around a table and said, how can we keep Black people, women, and naturalized Americans out? How can we make sure it never happens again? Because they weren't even sure that Clifton was a Black man. And the minute they found out he was Black, they actually sat down and put it in minutes. How do we keep these people out? They went to the President of the United States and they asked the President of the United States, please pass an executive order keeping Black people, women, and naturalized Americans out of the Foreign Service. And when President Coolidge said no, they said fine. And they literally spent 20, 30 years working at the highest levels of the State Department to deliberately and systematically keep out people who weren't white men. And so after Clifton Wharton passed, not another African American would be allowed in the State Department or allowed in the Foreign Service for 20 years after he passed, right? And so what you have is that, and even after that period in 1950s and 60s, you had a system that used the security clearance process, used oral exams, that was really hostile to women and minorities, a system that really didn't open up, but really were forced to open up because of lawsuits and because of outside interaction by Congress and by different various groups. And so when you have a system that was really built and designed and implemented in a way that was deliberate and intentional for 20, 30 years to keep people such as myself and Ambassador Ries and Elizabeth out of power, you're not going to overturn something like that with band-aids and piecemeal actions. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing this sense of like, oh, well, if we just put a band-aid here, if we just let in more of them, that's what we're looking for. But no, we really need to reimagine and rethink how we deal with diversity. It can't be something that's ancillary to diplomacy. It is diplomacy. Having a State Department that looks and feels like the United States is critical for our foreign policy initiatives, and it's critical to what we're trying to do as a country. It can't be something that, you know, it's something like right now, it feels very much like it's something that is on the checklist box of things that we need to do. It's like between re-engaging with Iran, maybe letting some Black people in and women in, and then we're going to get down there with Cuba as well. No, like if your State Department doesn't look like America and doesn't reflect America, other people notice these things too. Other countries notice these things too. And so, you know, in 1953, there was a congressional report and investigation into how to make the State Department more diverse. In 1962, President Kennedy hosted at the State Department equal opportunities for African Americans and women. How do we let them in? In 1986, George Shultz said that we have to have a State Department that reflects the view of America. In 1960s, there was a program set up by the Ford Foundation of the State Department that was to encourage more minorities to come into it. Dean Rusk really made it his effort in at least the early 60s to let more African Americans into the State Department. And what you see over time is just fits and starts where people really are engaged on this issue, and then they kind of give up because they have other things to do. You know, it's a sunny day. Like there's lots of reasons why people just lose the value in fighting for a State Department that looks like America. But ultimately, look, I just finished George Packer's book on Richard Holbrooke. Richard Holbrooke was a dynamite diplomat, served in the State Department for 40 years. I don't think I saw a single Black person in that book until about page 500 or 600. I didn't see a single woman who meant anything to this man until about page 500 or 600, right? And so if I could talk to Anthony Blinken, or if I could talk to anybody who's in charge of the State Department, I would ask them, if I wrote a 700-page biography of your life, what would be the first woman or Black person who would appear in your book? What would be the first time diversity would be an issue in your book? Because I've read books about Richard Holbrooke, I've read books about Dean Acheson, I've read books about Henry Kissinger, I've read books about Dean Rusk, and there's no discussion of diversity. There's no discussion of the need for diversity. Like, how do you manage to live in this country in a powerful position and have Black people and women just don't exist to you and your existence? Because that's not true of the American experience. And that's not true of what foreign countries look at and think about when they talk to us and see us as people, right? So when I served overseas, I would often talk to white officers who, you know, they would sit there and they could understand and they have better knowledge about every opposition group and every intricate part, like the price of cassava beans, right, in some of these countries. But if you ask them about George Floyd, if you ask them about Sandra Bland, if you ask them about the things that are going on in their own country, the foreigners seem to have more education about what was going on in America than the Americans do. And so I think that if we're going to reimagine the State Department, it really has to start at the top, and it has to have people who don't see this as just another checkbox and another thing that we need to do. It has to be something that is very much fundamental in changing the State Department. And if the State Department is to be serious, they have to look like America. That's something the military figured out long ago. And I think that's something the State Department needs to work on as well.
Thank you. And you know, as someone who worked in public diplomacy, I 100% agree. I mean, we can't have a diplomatic corps that isn't reflective of the United States when we're sending these messages of diversity and then we're not walking the walk at all. So it's critically important. And so it sounds like for you, meaningful change really needs to come, it needs to be embedded from the top, and it needs to be a cultural change, not just something that's written down somewhere, but that is led from the top. Is that correct?
Right, and it has to be consistent. You know, the people who spent 20, 30 years building this structure, they were motivated and dedicated to keeping out Blacks, women, and minorities, right? So we have to be just as dedicated, and think about this in 20, 30 years. When Joseph Grew, when the ambassador, when President Coolidge said, no, I'm not going to help you with this, basically what Joseph Grew in the leadership of the State Department said, it's fine. We're going to spend 20, 30 years working on this, and we're going to keep them out. And we have to have that same kind of passion on this issue and the same kind of commitment to letting people in as the people, as our predecessors were to keeping people out.
Terrific. Thank you. Sort of on the flip side of that coin about the diplomatic service looking like the United States, I think one element that we don't often talk about is the role that the diplomatic service plays in the perception within the United States public. And it's hard to believe, but about a year ago when the impeachment trials were going on, I was actually getting a lot of emails from people who knew that I had been in the Foreign Service briefly, and they were so impressed with Ambassadors Taylor and Yovanovitch, and were saying how just how they never knew that there was this level of dedication and professionalism, and they didn't know what diplomats did, and all of a sudden they had a peek into that, and then of course COVID came along and took everyone's attention away. But I'd love to just talk briefly about what the impact is of not actively engaging with the U.S. public about its diplomacy, particularly when we're saying that diplomacy needs to have a more valued position in government and in society. And how do you think we can rectify that? And Ambassador Ries, I'll turn to you first, and then I'll chime in with the others.
Well, one of the topics that came up fairly frequently in our conversations with former diplomats and former leaders in the intelligence community and on the military side of things, virtually all the groups we talked with, and we held 40 workshops in order to prepare the report that you saw. This topic came up fairly often, that our diplomacy needs to be at its very basis, fundamentally connected to the American people. And of course, to the point about diversity, which is also a topic which came up very consistently in every single workshop and every meeting we had. Being connected to the American people means being connected to all of the American people. There are ways to do this, and some of the things that we've proposed in our report, I think, would help with this. For example, one of the ways that we recruit for the State Department is through diplomatic advisors in certain colleges and universities, and there we do put quite a bit of emphasis on diversity. But I believe there are something like 18 of them out there, which isn't very much if you look at the size of the United States. So what we have proposed is a more activist recruitment policy that includes an ROTC-like program, like the military has, where people learn about the Foreign Service basically as undergraduates. We have some very excellent fellowship programs, but they're for graduate students. And a lot of the advice that we got was, you need to start sooner. So if you had programs like that in more American colleges and universities, more people would hear about the Foreign Service and what we actually do. So that would be one way. And another thing that we proposed, this came up a little bit in what Elizabeth was saying, was that we do need surge capacity. We need to be able to mobilize to deal with particular hotspots or crises in the world. And one way to do this would be to have a reserve corps, the way the military has. And that might have a reciprocal effect. In fact, it should have a reciprocal effect where people who are committed to the Foreign Service, let's say to some service 2 weeks a year or something like that, are more familiar with what the Foreign Service is and does because of their training and their activities, but also their communities would be more familiar with it from their contact with the reservists. So it should have a sort of a reciprocal effect. But it is glaringly obvious that that the American people, we are not sufficiently connected to the American people, and that needs to be attended to.
Yeah, Lizzie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just briefly add that it goes in both directions because the American people don't understand what we do. Is one of the reasons that it's so hard for us to get initiatives and support and resources for the State Department and diplomacy through Congress, because Congress responds to what its constituents care about. Its constituents in many parts of the country fully understand what the military does. They have relatives and friends and people in the military, or they have military industries in their hometowns. They get jobs through things that support the military. So there's a strong constituency there. But it also reflects back to whether or not the State Department and the folks who are on the front lines working on our diplomacy and our foreign policy really understand how that impacts Americans outside the Washington, D.C. Beltway and New York and areas of international organizations. So you would have a lot of benefits to really increasing the ties. And I agree with what Ambassador Ries said. We have a couple of programs, but they are not big enough to reach the Americans we need. They're big enough to reach the Americans who are already predisposed to wanting to seek out foreign policy information, who are at Ivy League schools where you have ambassadors going to be either residents or in later careers to teach. But you don't reach the communities that are not already connected to that very well. And that's one of the reasons we don't have a lot of diversity. I was born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi. I met the first diplomat and fully started to understand what it was when I was, I think, 24, 25. So I came into it later because it did not seem like it was an option to me. So I think that having that type of outreach, which we could do if we factored it in and valued it. We have things like hometown diplomat programs, which if you are a diplomat and you're interested and you're on home leave in your hometown, you can go and speak at a school or do something, but nobody gets credit for it. And frankly, it's a high bar to cross to have that kind of participation when you're back home. It would be a really low hanging fruit to find ways to facilitate that, give people credit in their kind of annual reviews for doing outreach to the American people, give them some resources. Say, did you want to write a letter to the editor in your hometown about how this foreign policy impacts your state? We'll help you, write it and give you some resources and give you some connections for that. Really low hanging fruit. Again, it's getting back to that cultural shift. That idea that part of what we do in our foreign policy is help Americans understand why it's important. And in return, they will help resource us to do what we need to do overseas.
And
yeah, thanks, Chris. What would you like to add? Yeah.
I'm just going to add really quick. I think that also when something happens, I think that we need to prioritize making sure that people from the State Department are actually in the forefront of discussing it. So example, when that minister got released in Turkey and he flew back to the United States and everyone's like, oh my God, I saw no one from consular who was speaking on this issue. And that was a huge thing that the State Department was involved in. So when Americans get released from jail, when Americans get saved overseas, when you hear these stories about Americans escaping from all these countries, we really need to find a way as a State Department to prioritize to make sure that diplomats are the ones who are on camera, who are talking about these issues, so that when people say, oh, so that's what a diplomat does, right? And so a diplomat is the one that's going to visit the American in jail. The diplomat's going to be the one that's going to help bring people back home. And so in the same way, when a military action happens, guess who you see? You see a general on TV, right? We need to see more diplomats, I think, on TV. And I think that that's a way that we can educate the American public as well on what we do.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Go right ahead.
Say, absolutely. The military invests in its reputation in America. In 2013 and 14, I was the consular officer on the ground in South Sudan when war broke out, and I was at the airport running our evacuations. Over the years, I have on 4 or 5 occasions seen military shows and interviews on various programs about how they ran those evacuations. They flew the planes. And they did all these glossy videos about it, and they look great doing it. Nothing from the State Department about how hard our team worked to get Americans to safety. Totally agree. We've got to invest in communicating that. Chris is right.
Yeah, yeah. And the irony of that is that when you enter the Foreign Service, it's one of the fundamental things that they underscore with you is that your primary duty is to be there for American citizens overseas. And so getting that message the other way is extremely critical. We have a lot of great questions coming in through Q&A, so I'd like to turn to them, and I'm going to do my best to try to reach as many as I can, and I might weave some of them together. And so to do that, I wanted to pick up on this idea of the reserve corps and also pull in a couple of inquiries we had about some of the currently unfilled positions and how, and apologies because I have to scroll through a lot of questions here, but how, what the plan is to really get people into unfilled positions, but then also, is there a plan for trying to bring back in people who may have left during the past 4 years at a comparable level to where they were, and is that part of the discussions that you're hearing?
Well, if I could take a little piece of this, the last piece about bringing people back in, turns out to be people have strong feelings on both sides of that question. We mentioned in our report that if you had mid-level entry, which by the way was maybe one of the most controversial of our recommendations, a carefully managed mid-level entry program, that could possibly be used to bring some people back. But a very distinguished diplomat, Jeff Feltman, has just published a long article in which he is against that. So it is a controversial subject, and I expect that there's going to be quite a lot of talk about it.
Could you just elaborate a little bit on what the pieces of controversy are, or what some of the critics are saying?
For people who have made a career in the Foreign Service and have started at the very bottom, doing their first consular tour and worked their way up, the feeling is that if you bring people back or bring people in at the mid-level, then their promotion opportunities, their chances to get the most attractive positions would be less. And people feel that they have served through good and bad times, and they shouldn't be disadvantaged by having stuck it out, and compared to people who have left. And so I think that's basically the arguments. There are arguments on both sides here, and I think this will continue to be a topic that people will discuss.
As to mid-level people who left, what do you have thoughts on this, Chris or Lizzie?
Lizzie first.
I was just going to say there is a method to come back in, and I know Chris is probably as well. Has gotten lots of emails from folks with the guidelines on how you return within 5 years as a Foreign Service officer. And there are some boxes you check, and you get sent wherever they want to send you. So there are ways that people who have left the career Foreign Service can come back in, but there are some big differences in, or there's some rifts in the culture, and I liken it to, as Chris and I have discussed before, when you're in a post-conflict situation overseas and you have the folks who fled, refugees, and then come back years later to a peaceful country to kind of help rebuild, there is a tension between the people who left the country, became refugees, got citizenship elsewhere, got education elsewhere, and the people who fought the battle and stayed in the country during the crisis. It's a very real tension that I've seen in post-conflict places, all across the globe, and many of us have. The challenge is that there are things that people in both positions can bring to the table, and how do you find a way to be able to capitalize on the skills and the experience that everyone has without giving short shrift to the people who might have sacrificed, other opportunities in order to stay, or to people who, have left and have moved forward in their careers and frankly don't want to come back to, kind of a stable position they were in several years ago. So it's going to be a real conflict for the State Department. I think it's going to be important that, people who return to the fray, are conscious and aware of the struggles that people who have been through a very morale crushing time at the State Department have. But I also hope that the people who are on the inside and have stuck it out we'll welcome, anybody coming back in to help us build back the State Department, because the State Department that we have today is not the same one we had 4 years ago. It needs more resources and it needs more support, but we're going to have to manage that potential conflict.
Yeah, and I would only add that, I've actually been very torn about this issue, because a lot of my colleagues, former colleagues in the State Department say, well, you didn't stay through the rough times, so why should, you be able to come back? Or even the idea that, I left the Foreign Service as like a 3 or whatever, and if I applied for a job that's a 2, like, that doesn't seem very fair. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to think about what's best for America and what's best for our foreign policy apparatus. The fact is that we are in desperate need of diplomats. We're in desperate need of doubling and really rebuilding our State Department. And as President Biden says, or President-elect Biden says, building it back better. And if a surge of former officers is what it's going to take to get the State Department to where it needs to be, then so be it. That's what we need to do. And I think that we all have to realize that, everyone in that kind of situation is going to sacrifice. It is one of those situations where, some people might be upset by it. And even for the officers coming in, it'll be a learning curve as well, and a steep learning curve as well. And so I think that it's something that we should definitely think about doing. But at the end of the day, my thinking is, especially on diversity, is just do something, all right? Like, I think that the State Department's biggest problem is that we talk and we talk and we talk ourselves out of doing anything. Because anything you propose is going to have like drawbacks. Anything you propose is going to have like controversy. And so the State Department, we just like to have a lot of committees and we talk about things to the point where we're just like, well, we've talked our way out of doing anything. And so at the end of the day, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, keep trying. And if it still doesn't work, then try something new. But we have to show that commitment to doing more than just talking about this stuff. And I think that idea of mid-levels hiring is a way to demonstrate that we're going to do more than just talk about diversity and talk about change.
Thank you for that. Your answer brings up a lot of points, I think, that we might not have delved deep into in this conversation, which is about the internal culture and some of the hierarchical nature and just the culture when it comes to risk-taking or innovation. My question here is, and this is a tricky one, but how, and it goes to the question of diversity as well, but this is a giant ship. How do you make that internal change and that cultural shift, and where does something like that come from? I know with diversity, Chris, you're saying it really needs to come from the top, but how are there other avenues to break open the culture a little bit more?
If I could take a first shot at that, I think it's quite right that that change has to come from the top. People have to see that that top management is committed to change. Change management, the whole field of change management, is a big one, and is something that we heard about from some of the people that we talked with, because both the military and the intelligence community have undertaken massive change in recent decades. And they had some ideas about that. But I think the second point is accountability and how you reward people. So, for example, in the area of diversity, if you don't hold people accountable for their actions, not just say okay, that person is aware of equal employment opportunity requirements and is respectful of them. No, it has to be something more than that. We have to hold people accountable for creating circumstances in their office or their embassy or whatever the unit that they supervise is, where people flourish, where it is a diverse atmosphere. It has to be part of how we reward people. It has to be part of our idea of what an excellent leader and manager is. It needs to be baked in, if you like, into our culture. So So I think that is one way. When we talk about, for example, education, part of Foreign Service culture is, well, really a good job is probably better. People who are offered educational opportunities sometimes actually turn them down in favor of a good job. So we need to reward people for taking time off for education, for earning degrees. And one way to do that is to look at how they've done in educational programs when it comes time for promotion and when it comes time for new assignments. I'd be strongly in favor of grading the courses that are given at the Foreign Service Institute to encourage people to really throw themselves into it. So I think you have to have a whole incentive structure. It isn't enough to say, okay, this is our goal. You really have to have accountability and really work on a change in the culture.
Thanks. We're getting a couple of questions that are inquiring about this balance of power between the State Department and the military. We have one from Dave Diaz, one from Michael Lawton, looking at what are the mechanisms. So what are the necessary required elements of either a White House-led legislative plan to rebalance resources and policies toward other instruments, or and then also to the point of the idea of the new Foreign Service Act, what are the necessary political steps to make the changes, and who would be leading that initiative to get a new Foreign Service Act? Ambassador Ries, I think this is probably falls in your camp.
Okay, so on a Foreign Service Act, I think that rebuilding and modernizing the Foreign Service would have to be something that both the executive branch and the legislative branch had a deep interest in. Otherwise, it couldn't succeed. And other Foreign Service Acts have been sort of a joint effort between the State Department and members of Congress. And of course, it would have to be bipartisan, because we're talking about a national institution here, and that would be a very important aspect of such an effort. And we would also need to look at what's good about the existing Foreign Service Act, because it has a lot of good features, and it gives the Foreign Service a lot of very good and important things. So any follow-on legislation, we'd want to make sure that we're keeping the good things, and then adding some more on top of that. So nonpartisan or bipartisan, and both. I think it's absolutely essential. It has to be both the executive and legislative branches.
Courtney,
Yeah, please
chime in on the political aspect of that, because as Ambassador Ries said, there are some very technical things that to follow in terms of paths of how to get the resources and how to build bipartisanship to get the right legislation passed, to make sure that we keep what we what's good and change what we need to improve on. But politically speaking, we need some interest, some public interest in rebuilding the State Department. And this gets back to what we spoke about very early on, which is getting the American public behind what is diplomacy, what does the State Department do, and why is that important to you? So this is why the military and the CIA both have entertainment liaison offices that engage regularly with Hollywood and other entertainment businesses to ensure that the American public knows what they're doing and why they're important. I'm not saying that we get into the movie business, but we need to invest more, much like others do, in getting the American public to know, because we do need bipartisan support to get this type of change and this type of shift from military in the lead to civilians in the lead. And to get that, you need Congress behind you, and Congress cares about what their constituents care about. So I think that's why it's incredibly important that we do invest in outreach to Americans.
Yeah, I think that it's an incredibly important point, and one that actually slides into the next question that I was going to ask. And because this on the kind of push-pull with the diplomacy and the military, the next question from James Ritchie asks, given that studies frequently reveal that American voters are apathetic about foreign policy and that isolationism is rising in popularity with populism, what are other ways we can make the American public care about foreign policy? And not to lead your answer, but I do think that idea that that foreign policy is in part diplomacy, but then if the diplomacy doesn't work, we're winding up with military, which does deeply affect most Americans, and they do know about it. I think it's an interesting question, but it's one that I'm quite passionate about. Is how do you get Americans to care more about foreign policy? Yes, Ambassador Ries.
One interesting point here is that one of the biggest champions of adequately resourcing the State Department is the U.S. military. Where General Mathis made this wonderful comment where he said, if you don't adequately fund U.S. diplomacy, I'm going to have to buy more bullets. And so this kind of describes it in a nutshell. And the other piece I wanted to mention, which we haven't mentioned, is economic diplomacy and support for American business. This is the other area. Beside helping people in emergencies, bringing them home when COVID broke out, tens of thousands of Americans, we really spent a lot of time supporting American business. As an ambassador, I once, did a sort of a back of the envelope calculation, and I was working on advancing American business about 40% of my time. So that's quite a big piece of what we do, and it is something that I don't think everyone is aware of, and it can be very important in a community. And nowadays, we also promote American investment in the United States as part of the responsibility of our diplomats. So that this is a very important part, economic diplomacy, of what the State Department does. And I think there probably isn't enough knowledge about that. We don't spend enough time talking about that.
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, and I would only add that, when the original Foreign Service Act was written to professionalize the service, the idea really was the brainchild of this guy named Wilbur Carr, who was just like a consular officer, a clerk even, and he really wrote this bill with congressmen. And so I think that as a State Department, when we're coming to thinking about, when we go to Julian Castro and Julian Castro is going to go to Tony Blinken, like we really have to think about where do we fit in this, and to make sure that our reports are being read by these people and being understood by these people as well. Because I think that as State Department people, I'm a former State Department person, we overestimate in the minds of these we have an overestimation of what these people know. I think that we have this idea that congressmen and presidents really understand the State Department and really understand what we do. But having talked to a few congressmen, I can tell you that they have no idea what we do. And I think that if we're going to have them writing bills, that we're very included and very involved in that conversation, just as we were in the 1980 Foreign Service Act and in the 1924 Foreign Service Act.
It's almost like a domestic public diplomacy, both on the outreach to individuals and then also at the government level. We're getting closer to time. Oh, but we have a time for a couple more questions. Then we're getting a few actually on the entrance exam. So looking at the beginning, and just trying to combine some of these. So one questioner wants to know whether it's possible for the testing requirement to be omitted in the future, or if there are any plans to change the testing requirement. And in particular, when you're looking at diversity initiatives, how does the Foreign Service Officer test play into that? And are there some good innovative ideas on how to revamp that process, or does that process need revamping? Anyone been thinking about that?
No one's jumping in.
Well, one thing I would say is that over time, the exam itself has been rewritten, and the entire entry process revamped multiple times. When I came into the State Department in ancient times, it consisted of a written exam, but then an interview with 3 people that lasted less than an hour, and that was it. And now, of course, there's a much more complicated entry process with activities and essays and whatnot. And I think that we have to look at what our objective is here. Um, what kinds of people that we need to bring in, and how, and reaching out much farther across and deeper into the United States, so that people know about the Foreign Service and are interested in coming in as part of bringing them in a more diverse workforce. So I imagine that people might think about whether the exam process that we have is producing what we need. But I guess I'm arguing for starting in the what do we need, having a look at what do we need and how do we get to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I think that we need to think about what is it, this exam process, what is that producing for us? And does that help define what diplomacy is as a country? I think that one of the bigger problems with the State Department is it's a very elitist culture. And I think that people think because they passed this big bad exam that they somehow are the smartest, baddest people in the room and in the world. And I think that have an exam process that, puts emphasis on your language and emphasis on how your knowledge of certain select American history, by the way, attracts a certain type of person who might not necessarily be the best diplomat. And I think that that's a conversation that we as a country really need to have, not just the Foreign Service, because a lot of officers really believe that the State Department belongs to them. It doesn't belong to us as officers. It belongs to the American people, and it belongs to all people. And so I think that we need to move away from this elitist idea. And I mean that also not just, and when I talk about diversity, I mean colleges too, right? I think that's something that you get conservatives on board with this as well, because the State Department is very much like pale male and Yale. And it very much focuses on those people who have the big degrees and went to the best schools. But those people don't necessarily reflect America, and they don't necessarily reflect America to other people in the world. And I think that that's a conversation that we need to have first. And then we say, does this test meet those needs that we have? And if it doesn't, get rid of it. Just because we've had it forever doesn't mean we should have it forever. Other people do different things, and we should at least be open and willing to do that. And the resistance to that is because we're such an elitist organization and take such pride in being, at the top levels of the world, or what's perceived to be the top levels of the world, without having that conversation about whether any of that actually means anything for diplomacy.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll have time for one more question just to wrap it up, and this is sort of our final thoughts question as well. And so, looking at the geopolitical landscape, for each of you who've been immersed in this idea of changing the Foreign Service and changing the U.S. diplomacy, what's the biggest thing on the horizon that you think we need to be prepared for, to be able to adapt to, that we aren't currently able to in our system as it is? Lightning round.
I'll do really quick. The world is
all right, Chris, you're up.
The world is getting browner, and the Foreign Service is still pretty white. And if you don't have a Foreign Service that looks like America or even looks like the world, that is going to be our challenge for the 21st century, because people aren't going to take us as seriously, especially when we talk about human rights, we talk about climate change, and we talk about these things to other countries. If we don't have people who look like America speaking to the rest of the world in an honest, ethical, and reasonable way, then we're going to have challenges.
I'd add one more dimension that's quite different, which is that a lot of the challenges that we're facing in the world today have to do with either science or tech. And I think we really need to face that head on and figure out how we have people and resources to give us the understanding that we need of those issues. And there are new horizons: Antarctica, the Arctic, space. So we really need to look at how we acquire knowledge of those things that can adequately support our diplomacy in those areas.
Perfect. Lizzie?
Well, I will wrap up by saying that one of the biggest challenges we are going to have, not just as our diplomats, but as a country, is moving forward with more humility. We are not a hegemon that is all powerful. We have proven over the last couple of decades that when we go it alone, we do not necessarily leave either our own country or other countries better off than we found them. Not only that, but with the nature of the big national security threats that we are facing, things like climate change, things like pandemics, things like economic struggles that we're dealing with right now in the world, we cannot deal with those alone. We can certainly play a leadership role, and we should, but we do not have either the capacity or really the interest to be the ones who are trying to fix all of this on our own. And we've proven that we can't. So we need to go out there and be ready to play well with others, to compromise where we need to, not on our principles, but maybe on being the loudest voice in the room. I think that in the aftermath of the Trump administration, it's going to be a really great time not to go back out and say, okay, ignore the last 4 years. We're here, we're back, we're the leaders. I mean, I think we're going to have to say, oh, that was something that could happen here, and that could diminish our global position of leadership. That's something that was allowed to happen on our watch. We have a lot to learn from not only the strengths of other countries, but the mistakes that other countries have made as well. And I think that too often we think that we are somehow immune to that. Well, I think what the last 4 years has certainly shown us, if not the past couple of decades, is that we are not immune to those problems, and we need the help of our friends in the rest of the world, not only to succeed for the world, but succeed for us as a country as well.
Thank you all for taking the time today. Thanks to everyone who was listening and asked terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but really I thank the three of you for your service in the State Department, and then also since leaving the State Department and putting your minds to really, really important questions. So I really appreciate the time. We will put this up on our YouTube channel, so if you missed part of it or want to share it with anyone, please do check that out. Our next event is on the 11th at noon, and that is on Change on the Horizon, and it's the shifting alliances in the Middle East. So we'll be taking a good look at that with Ambassador Indik, Sanan Vakil, and not Chris Richardson, but Hussein Ibish. So we'll make that change. So thank you, everyone. And we are a nonprofit and really trying to keep this briefing series free and open to everyone. So if you have the means, I do encourage you to donate to Network 2020. These are important conversations, and we've been reaching people in almost 90 countries, and we'd really like to be able to keep this open to all. So thank you everyone for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.